I'm Ellie Court, Soars for Life CEO, bringing you this episode of the Soars for Life podcast. Over the years, we've heard from many farmers about creeks and rivers that are severely eroded and landscapes that have lost their ability to absorb and store water. In big rain events, water runs off and is gone in a matter of days or even hours. We've become accustomed to this. But what did those landscapes look and function like 100 years ago or 200 years ago? Can farmers restore creeks and landscapes to their full potential, holding on to water for longer and utilising it better? This episode is a collaborative effort with our friends at Mulloon Institute as part of their Communities of Practice project. In it, I chat with Charlie Maslin, an amazing land steward raising cattle and sheep on the Monaro in New South Wales. Charlie took me on his journey of landscape repair, which began with a change in grazing practices to improve ground cover, and then moved on to focus on repairing his degraded waterways to rehydrate the landscape and support a thriving and productive agro-ecosystem. I first visited Charlie's farm in 2021, and the land was alive with water, grass, frogs, birds, insects, and platypuses playing in the waterways. The effects of his steady, thoughtful changes to his management approach were crystal clear, and I'm delighted to share his story in this episode. Enjoy. Charlie Maslin, welcome to the Soars for Life podcast.
Thank you, Ellie. Lovely to be with you.
I'm really excited to be having this conversation. It's actually our first podcast ever recorded in person. And normally I do this over Zoom, so it's really nice to be sitting here at your place, Gunningrah. So could you just tell us a little bit about where we are and a little bit about Gunningrah?
Okay, Gunningrah is a farm near Bombala on the southern end of the Monaro. A large part of the property is part of the treeless plains, so as you drive through you'd think it had all been cleared, but it's naturally treeless with largely basalt soils. This area was settled in about the 1840s. And our family came here in 1911. We've been here since. So it's no cropping enterprises, all grazing. Luckily, it's a well-watered property with quite a large stream running through the centre of it. And yeah, good fertile soils, a very variable rainfall, which most of Australian farming has to contend with. The average rainfall is about 550 mils, but it goes anywhere from 250 mils, which is about half that, up to double, up to about 1,200 mils in the very odd year. So yeah, good soils, a good cold climate, warm summers, and a very variable rainfall.
And you were saying just before we started recording that you've had a bit of an interesting spring so far.
Yeah, spring's been a challenge. We've had a very variable year. It was almost like Ireland in January and February. We had a lot of rain, it was really good. Then autumn just came to a halt and we were dry. A little bit of rain through winter, but we probably haven't had a fall of double-digit millimetres since probably about June.
Yeah, well, the wind's howling at the moment and the fire's on. It's nice and warm in here, but hopefully it turns into some rain soon. And the land's been managed, as you said, by your family for over 100 years, and you grew up here. So what was it like growing up here?
Oh, it was a wonderful place to grow up. When I was a child, there were probably about five or six people working on the property, so there were quite a lot of families. And the place was probably about 30% smaller than it is now. So it was a lovely environment to grow up and, yeah, a very sound community.
The farm has mainly been run as a sheep property, with the main enterprise being producing wool.
For the large part of the time it has been. When I came back, we were probably about 80% sheep and maybe 20% cattle, which was pretty much the recipe for this district. But over the last 3 decades I've changed to be running more cattle, and we'll probably sort of in the future go more heavily into cattle. They tend to be much kinder to the landscape, I think, as far as their grazing habits go. When I was a kid there were 5 or 6 people here. For the bulk of the time I've been running the property, we've only had one other staff member. So it's just been 2 of us running it, and we've increased the numbers. So cattle are much easier to run a high DSE sort of per man operation.
And so when did you start managing the property, and at that time, what were your goals, what were your intentions?
I came back in the early 80s. I worked in Sydney for a bit in the cattle futures market, and then I came home and was here probably for about 3 years when I sort of swapped over from my father and took over running the place. It had gone from being quite a high labour place to a very low labour place, and we went through some pretty difficult years. So I guess my first couple of years was looking at making the place more labour efficient so we could run it more easily with less people. And also, I suppose I sort of had an economics background, so I did a lot of comparative analysis stuff with the local accountants, and we were working out the cost of production of beef and wool. So I really looked at probably the economics of the enterprise. I looked at making the place more labour efficient. We built laneways so we could handle stock more easily. So the first decade was probably doing all the stuff, not looking at grasses or soils, but looking at all the infrastructure and the actual management of it. And then, so the goals then were to lower the cost of production, to become more DSEs per man, all that sort of stuff. And then that has all changed, I guess, over the last couple of decades.
And so when was that? When did you come back?
I came back here in 83,
Yep.
and then I sort of took over in about the end of 86, in the middle of a really challenging drought. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what did the place look like at that time during the drought, and what were some of the issues you were facing?
There was no reticulated water anywhere. It was divided into probably about maybe 55, 60 paddocks. We had the Camelon Creek, which runs down through the centre of the property with good water holes. So that watered a lot of the paddocks along the flats. But all the other paddocks were really watered by dams. And during the droughts, the dams became a real problem. And when I came back, because there was no troughing system or reticulated water, a lot of paddocks, as the dams dried up, paddocks were being opened up to the creek for the stock to water. I just vividly remember there's probably about 15 or 16 k's of the Camelon running through us, and most of that corridor was really pretty much devoid of plants because of the stock pressure that was on there every day. The property had been pretty much set stocked from about probably the Robertson Land Act days of 1860 when things were fenced up. So the set stocking and the lack of reticulated water, it really limited your management options when it did get dry. And so when you looked across the land, it looked like it had pretty good cover and looked like it was all pretty healthy even in the dry times. But when you started to look down, all of a sudden it became exposed that you could see there's a lot of bare ground. And there was an agronomist who came here, was doing a trial with me and with the MLA on supplementary feeding heifers. And he was measuring the ground cover, and he said to me, "What is your ground cover?" And I said, "Oh, it's probably about 85%. And he said, "Yeah, go down a bit." And I said, "Oh, 82, 81." And it was 65% ground cover, and which really alarmed me. So basically a third of the soil was bare and 2/3 was covered. But there was effectively only really about a third of the soil was covered with live growing perennial plants. Roughly a third was dead material and weeds growing, and the other third was bare ground. Our factory of producing grass for animals was really weak, and that's the thing that really alarmed me to change the way we grazed. And I said to him, what do I do about that? That's something I've never had to really, I'm not aware of. And he said, "You've got to change your grazing." And I said, "How do you do that?" I was only aware of set stocking, so that's where the change happened.
So we'll talk a bit more about the grazing in a minute, but I guess I'm interested to hear a bit more about what was the implication of having that bare ground and having that lower level of ground cover than you expected. What were the impacts that was having on the business and on the landscape?
Well, I think the first thing is we weren't utilising water well because the water was running off. Streams were continuing to erode. When we got a storm, there was nothing there really to hold it. And so if you had a 25 mils in a thunderstorm, the effective infiltration of that, if it came quite as a quick burst, was really low. And so the effects of that were, first, we had very poor utilisation of rainfall, and the second thing was we had pretty bad weed issues. And to the extent that we ended up getting goats in to eat the weeds as a sort of what we thought were a complementary enterprise, but they were really just treating the symptom of bad management. And so we had up to a couple of thousand goats at one stage, sort of eating briars, eating thistles and things, and they certainly changed the way we managed weeds, but they weren't changing the way we managed the land.
Mm. And you mentioned that the creeks had very little ground cover, especially when you had to open them up to water the cattle. Can you just describe what it looks like when a creek that is devoid of living vegetation experiences a rainfall event?
When the first good rain we got, we had it was about 6 inches came in March, and it really came with a hell of a burst. And just the sight of unbelievably muddy waters, you could see places where parts of the banks were collapsing away. The basalt is much more resilient than the sort of lighter soils. Granites and slates tend to erode much more, but the effect was pretty marked. And I sort of didn't like what I saw, but I didn't think there was much I could really do about it. I just took that as a given at the time.
I'm interested to know how these sorts of issues had been seen historically, maybe by your parents and by your grandparents, or how they'd been managed historically. You talked about the weeds and the ground cover and the water infiltration and maybe some of the erosion in the riverbanks. How had the previous generations of managers of this land thought about those issues and managed them?
I'm not too sure there was all that much thought about managing them. I can remember saying to my father one time, what was the landscape like when you took it over? Has it changed much? And basically, I think the bulk of the erosion of the streams happened probably in maybe the 1840s to 1860s. When Strzelecki came down and went through the high country, one of the comments he made when he went through sort of Bredbo, Cooma, Berridale and up to the main range, he said the settlers are not improvers of the land, they're spoilers. And I think what he had seen was a lot of the gullies had become incised by then. So I imagine he saw a very incised and freshly eroded landscape that probably alarmed him. And over the last century, a lot of those watercourses have grassed up, so the incisions don't look so new and fresh. So I think to answer your question, I think by the time my father and grandfather were here, a lot of that stuff had grassed up quite a bit, and they just took that as being the way the landscape probably always was.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not necessarily easy to see now walking around your property, but you've made some pretty significant changes over the years since those early realizations about what was happening, and particularly some changes to manage water on the property. So can you just describe those interventions in general? What have you changed specifically around managing the way that water flows through the property?
Well, when a couple of other farmers about here had started to do the grazing for profit stuff, so the first thing I did was went and had a chat to them and went armed with a long list of questions as to why it wouldn't work here. And as I went through each of those questions, I were able to bat them off to the boundary and say, you know, this is what we do and it does work, give it a go. So I did that, and I did a grazing for profit school, which was really interesting. And then from there, we were originally just going to do a trial on about 2,000 acres with just a mob of dry sheep, some wethers and some steers, and just give them 2,000 acres to start moving them around to see how it worked. And I remember it was about March 1997, and the weekend we were about to start, it was going into autumn, the weekend we were about to start to do this trial, we had about 2 inches of rain, and it was going to be really a good thing to set us up for autumn and for winter. And so the bloke who was here working with me at the time, we just thought, bugger it, if it's good enough for 2,000 acres, why don't we just do the whole place? And if it doesn't work, we'll get the drafting gate out and draft everything up and put them back where they were in 2 months' time. So we did the whole, it was about 8,000 acres, and we did the whole property, put all the sheep and cattle together and started. And as we found problems with water and gateways and other issues, we had a bit of time by the time they came back to that paddock to sort the problems out. So it was just basically a suck it and see. And anyway, as time went on, we've kept on doing it. So to answer your question, the first thing that happened was the ground cover improved quite quickly. We went from sort of probably the mid 60% up to probably might have taken 3 or 4 years to get up to the 80s, and then we sort of crept up to the 90s. And as that happened, all of a sudden you could see that a lot of dams where Terry McCosker said in the Grazing for Profit School, if you rely on dams for your water, once you change your grazing, you probably won't be able to rely on them as much because you don't get the runoff. You tend to manage water much better. We noticed that the water cycle was improving, that we were getting a lot less runoff, that the ground cover was improving, and especially all the riparian areas where along the watercourses where there had been a lot of stock pressure. The first year it was terrible. There were variegated thistles growing like sugarcane crops. They were massive. But all that organic matter, once it broke down, and once the stock weren't there all the time, they really recovered quite quickly. And it was in the space of a couple of years, reeds started to appear where we hadn't seen them growing, and the banks started to grass up. And so the riparian areas with the extra moisture there really recovered quite quickly. And so we noticed, the less runoff into dams, we noticed the ground cover improving, we noticed the perennial species starting to dominate, and we noticed that the watercourses were starting to, they were starting to slow down, and that led us to making other changes in the watercourses.
So you touched on quite a few things there. I just wanted to wind back to the trial. Is it right to say that the trial was putting into practice some of the things you'd learned at the Grazing for Profit course around rotating the animals. Could you just talk a little bit about what you were actually putting into practice?
Okay, so we went from having, say, 60 paddocks with 50 odd mobs of sheep and probably 25 or 30 mobs of cattle. We got down to about 3 mobs of cattle and maybe about 4 mobs of sheep. So we went from having about 100 different mobs all together down to about 5 or 6. So then we just gave each mob an area where they moved around and just gave it a try. And with the rain, all of a sudden you could see things starting to improve. And I think the single thing it did was it really put your antennas up when it starts to get dry and you start to run out of feed. As you move the mob around, when you get back to paddock number 1, if there's been no rain and no growth, it's a pretty confronting decision you've got to make. There's one of the blokes who was grazing here that I went to see, and he said it's a bit like stepping out of an old Mini Minor and jumping into a Formula One car. The corners come up a lot quicker. And they do come up a lot quicker, but it really makes you make decisions a lot earlier. Do you send them on adjustment? Do you buy a feed in? Do you reduce the numbers? Or do you start selling? That's the thing I think that really made the difference.
And so that was a direct way of addressing this low ground cover. But you also mentioned that this had a knock-on impact in terms of the creeks and the water quality. You mentioned also the weed issues in the creeks in the first year. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
The repair to the riparian areas was probably the fastest. I didn't sow any seeds or plant anything there, it just happened. And it was just purely the rest. It's really important also, I think, to have animals as part of that recovery process. The more degraded an area is, probably the longer rest period you give it, and with a brief, intense grazing, and then a long rest period again. And the areas that weren't too badly in not too bad a condition, they could just be grazed as part of the normal pattern. So initially I thought we'd probably fence off the main part of the creek right through the place, but it really hasn't been necessary. As long as it gets rest with the grazing, I think you can look after them pretty well.
Yeah, amazing. And so you mentioned that the grazing management was the first thing that you went to, but then you did move on to some other sort of different management approaches around the waterways. So can you talk a little bit about how that started and how you even knew to go in that direction?
I'd always been really interested in what things looked like prior to 1788. It fascinated me. You could see where old watercourses went and the creek was no longer near those. And I think when Peter Andrews first was on Australian Story, I saw that story and I thought that applies up in the Hunter Valley. You know, they've got water running out of sandstone cliffs up there and they've got permanent water flowing through, and I thought it works up there, but that sort of won't work. Not it won't work here, but it doesn't really apply as much. I saw the story and I was really interested in it, but I didn't really do anything about that. But only a couple of neighbours away had him down for a field day, and I thought I'll go along and listen to him. And within about 15 minutes of his talk, he had lots of diagrams and cross sections and stuff, and I just really related to them all. And he was able to describe stuff that really always puzzled me, and he was able to describe how to bring it back to what it was. And so the lights went on. So I went up and saw him afterwards and said, what are you doing tomorrow? And he said, he sort of grumbled around, and he said, why? And I said, well, can you come up the creek a bit and come to our place? So he came here and we walked. It was a really foggy morning, and to start, there was a really thick fog, and so you really couldn't see more than sort of 50 yards in a lot of places beyond where we were. And he was able to say, he hears words like energy and things, and he'd say, there's a lot of energy coming in from the right here. Well, tell me what happens up there. And sure enough, that's where one major watercourse came in, and he could see it just by what was happening in the bank of the creek where the water used to flow in. And so it was almost like going around with the blindfold on, being able to tell you, what was happening. I was pretty impressed by that. And he's a very interesting character. And I ended up going up to Bylong Valley, and I had a couple of days with him on his property, and I could see what he was doing there. And I could see that this stuff he was talking about really works. And the drier the climate, probably the more it works, and the more in size streams are. And as Tony Coote, when he came down to a field day here one day from Mulloon Creek, he had the people in the car with him counting the number of incised rivers and streams on one hand and the number of intact ones on the other hand. And when they got here, I think it was something like 165 to 1. So they saw one stream that was intact and 165 that were incised, and that's what our landscape is like. And leading on from what I said before about the variable rainfall, the way that rivers used to run with these chains of ponds and big soaks and large marshes, and the water was really slow moving through the landscape. And that really resonated with me, and I understood what he was on about. And so, I said, well, okay, what have we got to do here? And he's just sort of said a few places in the main creek where you'd put structures in. And of course, that was way beyond any capabilities I had. So off he went, and he was in demand all over the place at the time. And so there's no way I could get him to come here to do any projects. So I thought, I'll just start to try some myself. So there's one little creek. We were building a big dam up there. And when we finished building the big dam, I walked down the stream and I thought, okay, where would I put some structures in, just earthen ones? And so in 2 days, the guy with the excavator, we built 20, which was basically an hour's work with each one as we went down the stream. And I thought I'll give them a go. It's a bit like changing the grazing. If they don't work, well, maybe you can just dig them out or cut a hole through the wall. And if you just relied on the grazing and let it heal without doing any work to any structures, you'd have to live for a very, very long time to see the results of it, because for the reeds to hold the soil and for it to slowly build up would take, just decades and decades and decades. So I thought I'd give it a try. So we just started doing small structures in small streams. And sure, you have one or two blowouts, things that don't go too well, but you have a lot that work pretty well, and so we could see the results of it pretty quickly.
Yeah, so what have the results been? Because you've now been doing this for 30 years or more.
Well, just little streams that were totally intermittent, that would, with a thunderstorm, might flow for a day. Some of them might flow for 2 days. Some of them are incised maybe a metre, metre and a half, 2 metres. Some of them are incised by 7 or 8 metres. All sorts of different ones, but the water just vacated the landscape really quickly.
And when you say incised by, you mean essentially sort of a cliff face that the water has caused, a channel that the water rushing through has carved off from the edge of the stream. Yeah. And some of those were 7 or 8 metres high.
Some even more in some of the lighter country. In the basalt ones were mostly probably 2 to maybe 3 metres, but a lot of the ones in the lighter country were much deeper. Even just where we put the small structures in, the first event that came down, they all filled up with water. Sometimes where the water gets away from them, there might be a problem where the water comes back into the stream, so we had to do a bit of remediation there. But as long as if we kept the ground cover up really well where the structures were, that really helped for the small amount of damage that might be caused with the overflow. Most of them we put a pipe through so that it's the trickle effect of the last bit of when the ground gets soft, that if it's left to trickle for a long time, that will tend to cut another channel. So we'd put an overflow pipe through, which would sort of stop the trickle effect. But it was really interesting. All of a sudden, reeds started to appear in those ponds. There were no reeds at all in the main creek, probably 4 or 5 k's away. But the water was there, the ducks came, maybe they had seeds on them, and the reeds have all grown. So we've only just grassed the banks that we've built, and then all the stuff that's happened around the water themselves has just happened by animals bringing it.
And that's all a result of those structures having slowed the flow of that water.
Yeah. And I often wonder sort of if there was a storm at the top end of the Cambalong Creek in 1787, it might have taken it 12 months to make it down to here and then another 12 months to get it down to the Bombala River. Whereas today, that storm, if it's a heavy one, it's down here in about sort of 3 hours flowing through, and it's down the Bombala River by nightfall. And it's
along with a lot of soil.
Along with a lot of soil, and all that water's gone. Whereas putting these structures in, it slows the flow down. So we have one little stream just in front of the shearing shed where we've just put 3 weirs in. The first thing is that when the water flows in, it's really very soil laden. It's quite dark. But by the time it comes out through the bottom weir, it's slowed down, the sediment's dropped out, and it's basically clear drinking water. So all that sediment stayed there, and that little stream, instead of flowing for a day, with a good fall when those weirs fill up, it usually flows for about 12 weeks or so, which is really interesting. It's only just a trickle at the end of the 12 weeks, but before it was just a one-day wonder. So now it's 12 weeks. So maybe if you can do that on a catchment basis, you can turn what is an intermittent water source into a permanent stream.
Yeah, and for the driest continent on Earth.
So important, yeah.
And so you mentioned the reeds starting to recolonise these smaller streams and the ducks coming back. What else have you seen in terms of the life that those changes have been able to support?
Bird life is obviously, with permanent water, is more apparent. One of the field days we had here, someone just said he didn't have a question, he wanted everyone to shut up, so everyone was quiet, and all of a sudden they were counting the number of different frogs they could hear croaking along the stream. So there's obviously a lot of that life. You can't see it or count it, but it's pretty apparent. And also, we've got quite a lot of platypus and stuff in the stream. That's in the mainstream. There's been about 14 holes I've counted them, seen them in through the property, which is good. I haven't really got a data log of what's happened, but it is apparent to the eye.
And so over that 30 years, I guess there've been obviously some very extremely dry periods, and there's been some very wet years as well, including the last couple of years. I'm interested to know how you've seen the land responding, given that you have seemed to be able to increase the efficiency or the way that the land's able to store and hold water.
When you get the good years, it's really easy to ramp up the stocking rate and increase your production. And we talk about the amount of production you can get off the land, but I think one of the most important decisions that we don't really talk about a lot is when you take the foot off the accelerator and start to back off the numbers. And so we just keep a track of the number of DSCs we're running per 100 mils of rain we're getting. And so we try and keep that it's really hard to keep it in a very tight band because you have lambing and calving and things and numbers go up and down, but we've got a benchmark that we look toward, and once we're running too many stock for the amount of rain we've had, it's time to reduce the numbers a bit. And I think when you reduce the numbers going into the dry times, or whether even if you don't reduce them and just contain them, if you want to keep the numbers up and contain and feed them in a small area and have that as a sacrificial paddock, which we've done in the last dry time, I think that's well worth doing. But it's keeping enough perennial plants there and not grazing the life out of them when it gets dry. And it's really interesting that when you do get rain after a dry period, how quickly those do respond. And I've taken quite a few photos of fence lines where we've had a containment lot and the paddocks where we've rested the grasses and the response where plants have still got a little bit of leaf area. It looks pretty dismal when you look at it when it's dry, but it's amazing how quickly it responds and how quickly you get the ground cover back to where it was. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about the business side of things as well, and I was reading over your case study, one of the early Soils for Life case studies, and you talked a bit about being concerned in the early years about how affected by rainfall variability the profitability of the business was. And so is that something that you've seen change, and if so, what do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I remember in the 80s our cost of production for wool at the time went from about $2.50 a kilo. This is going back a little while, it's in the 80s, but it went in 1 year it was $2.50 and the following year was $5, purely with a decrease in the amount we were producing and decrease in numbers. Cattle were worse, they went from 40 cents a kilo to produce a kilo of beef to $1.20, it tripled. And so that really alarmed me. And it also made me diversify a bit out of agriculture. I thought, I don't want to rely on this going into the future if this is going to continue. So I'd end up doing quite a lot of outside diversification. And it was funny, whether it was not relying so much on the property for everything and making things a bit easier for the place, that as we sort of looked after the land a bit more, our profitability started to not have the highs and lows it did before. I graphed it for a while with the number of stock we had and our rainfall, and profitability seemed to be starting to rise, and the variability wasn't anywhere near as great. So I think when we changed the way we ran the place, I don't think we were fighting the droughts anywhere near as hard. We weren't backing the trucks in with feed, and because you never know how long it's going to go for, and trying to fight them and keep the numbers on, and then the recovery period when it does rain is longer. So I think we were coming out of them quicker and having more options to play with when they came along. So I think profitability did seem to be rising and not as variable.
I mean, you've been at this a long time, and especially when you were starting out, some of these things weren't widely adopted, weren't necessarily the normal way of doing things, and you were sort of going out on a limb trying something new. How did you navigate that process of deciding to go in this direction and deciding what to do when it wasn't something that most people were doing? And how did that feel as well?
Well, it's something that didn't really worry me. The couple of guys I went to see initially, they were fellows who stood out on a limb as well, and they were quite strong individuals. And to me, I sort of looked at it, even when we got the goats, a couple of the neighbours looked over the fence and openly laughed at me and said, "What are you doing with them?" And one of them ended up buying quite a few goats from me the next year when they saw what had happened to the thistles and the briars, and they ended up running a similar number to us. I think, and also my father, right back from being involved in the place, and he thought I did a couple of other things with the cattle and sheep that he didn't really agree with, and I think he was pretty sceptical about what I was doing, and I just took that as a sign that maybe I was on the right track and it was time for a change, and so rather than take offence at it, I sort of took strength out of it, and so if people laughed, and you knew yourself, you could see the changes happening, and that gave you the courage to keep going with it. So being a bit different didn't worry me, and still doesn't. If they want to think that, they can. But I know how it's worked and what's happened, and happy to keep doing it.
And it's interesting because you're obviously not someone who leaps into things uninformed. You said you went along to the Grazing for Profit course and to the Peter Andrews talk with your lists of things, of reasons of why it wouldn't work here. Yeah. But I guess you listened and followed what you thought made sense.
Well, they answered the questions, and also when we changed the grazing, we could have, if after a month of it we'd had enough of it, we could have just split everything back up and put them back the way they were with the stuff in the streams. It was all just a bit of a drip, trying little bits and pieces here and there and seeing how they worked. And as you do it, if it works, you'll do more. If it doesn't work, you'll stop. So there's no harm done with any of it. You can pull a structure out of a creek in 10 minutes with a tractor, or you can go and build another one in an hour. So it's just a matter of, if it works, keep on giving it a go.
Now you mentioned weeds a couple of times, and you mentioned the goats a moment ago. And the first time I came here, I will never forget a story you told me about a paddock that, for as long as you can remember as a child, had been covered in thistles. I just wonder if you could relate that story again, because that really struck a chord with me when I first heard it.
Sure. There's one part of this creek where there's a long water hole with quite a lot of platypus, so we used to walk down there to look at them quite often. But when we went down there, especially when the kids were little, I had to get a mower and mow a track through the thistles so that they could get there without, there were saffron thistles sort of up to your waist, and sometimes the other ones up a bit higher. Within 2 years of changing the grazing, it went from being this weed-infested area that you couldn't get to basically being grasses. The thistles weren't germinating, and it's basically sort of a strong native perennial pasture, that part. And it's still the same to this day. There's the odd thistle grows here and there, but there's nowhere near the problem.
Was that simply as a result of changing the way the cattle rotated through that area, allowing them in for a short period and then letting that area rest for a long period? Is that all that changed there?
Pretty much. That particular paddock, it was about 300 acres, and we divided it into two as well so that we could put a bit more grazing pressure and increase the rest. So the difference was the rest period that was given for the perennials to grow and for them not to be nipped back all the time. And the ground cover went from a really low base, because when it was set stocked, the stock would always be down near the water where it was cooler, where the water was, all day. So that's why there were very few. It's a bit like around a dam. There's very few plants around a dam. And it was the same along the watercourse. So it went from being probably one of the most denuded areas of the place to pretty quickly recovered to being much higher ground cover. And it would have gone from, a lot of the watercourse areas would have been probably 15, 20% ground cover at the end of a drought. And all of a sudden it went up to 95, 100. So the competition for the thistles really just blew them out of the water pretty quickly.
A lot of the story here is about water, and I'm interested in how your thinking about water has changed over the years.
It's changed sort of probably in multiple ways, because before it was, with it being set stocked and relying on dam water, we couldn't rely on the dams anymore with reducing the runoff, and so we've had to put in quite a big reticulation system. So now we've built quite a big dam high up in the place where we can gravity feed probably about 50-60% of the property just with gravity fed through poly pipe. So we put lots of troughs in. So we've gone from a dam-based system to a trough-based system. We've still got, all those dams are still there. They fill up and are used well and good. The creek system is there. The water in it is more reliable because we get the flows. At one point in the 90s, about 7 kilometres of our main creek dried up, which had never happened before. There were pools that were up to 500 metres long and probably, 2 to 3 metres deep, were bone dry. I took my father down there one day to see it, and he'd never seen anything like it before, So I don't think that had happened, and that really alarmed me. And initially I didn't want to do anything to the main creek. Even the legislation around this stuff is still pretty tenuous, and people are still being fined for different activities, and to tamper in the mainstream wasn't a good thing, but I got to the point where I couldn't not do it because there were some really simple interventions that took maybe an hour with a tractor and a few rocks to really make a difference. And I was really worried about the water going for the platypus populations and stuff. To me, that was really alarming. So I thought, bugger it, if they want to come and lock me away, well, they can do that. But I'm doing it purely for environmental reasons, and if it's being done for good reason, it really is helping the community downstream. And at one of our Landcare meetings some years later, the furthest fellow downstream on the Camberlong said the only projects he wanted to happen were more things done on the creek here because he could see the benefit he was getting. The quality of water had improved and the reliability of the flow had improved. And so if you can get those outcomes in this dry continent of highly variable rainfall, I think it's a good thing.
You mentioned before that you had learned about what the landscape might have looked like before Europeans arrived. Do you use that as a guide to what you're trying to achieve with water in the landscape now?
For sure. I think it's really interesting with where we've put some weirs in where the water table is lifted up even just maybe a metre. There's the visible water. Peter Andrews always said, everyone is obsessed with the water they can see, but the way it worked was you could probably originally see maybe 5 or 10% of the water, and there was 95 or 90% of the water underneath the ground where it couldn't be evaporated, it couldn't be blown away by wind, and it was moving slowly through. And once in places where we've lifted even just the water table up probably a metre, it's really interesting. I'd use a drone a little bit, especially when it's dry in summer. If you fly it up and get it up quite high, you can see areas where the water is moving under the ground. You can see that, especially if there's lucerne plants there or any deep-rooted perennials, you can see the green strips where water's running now where it didn't used to run. So you can see where the streams used to connect up. There's a few billabongs that had been dry for all of my time until recently. As the water's come up, they've started to fill up again. So it's really just lifting that water table up under the ground and where plants can access it. But also that when it does get dry, when there's nothing flowing in the top end, you've still got that water there to slowly make its way downstream. At Mulloon Creek, for instance, they've had periods where they've had no water flowing in the top end for 6 months, and they're still getting a regular 200,000 litres a day, whatever the figure was, flowing out the bottom pool of Mulloon. And that's purely by those interventions. Before those interventions were put there, if there was nothing flowing in the top end, there was nothing flowing out the bottom end. And so it's just really just slowing down, putting a water shock absorber in, if you like, to slow down the flow. And the more you can slow it down, that last bit might be going out the bottom end, and 3 years later you get a storm or the rains come and it tops it up again. So we've really got to slow things down a bit. And it's Australia-wide. Doesn't matter where you go. You very rarely see a stream that's intact.
Yeah, yeah. That water flowing out even after the top of the stream is dry, that's the sponge, that's the soil sponge slowly releasing the water that it's managed to absorb over time. You mentioned the 95% of the water that is under the ground that's stored in the soil, and I've heard the visible pools and dams described as the windows onto the underground water, not as the store themselves.
Yeah. We had one day with Peter Andrews up here, we were up at a stream at the back of the place where it's only quite a small stream, but there's probably 10 or a dozen weirs further up the stream. We're standing on one bit where there's quite a lot of, as the water slows down, all the sediments dropped out, and this pool or this eroded gully is basically now filled up. And when people were there was a bit of water in the pond above, and there's a bit of water in the pond below, but all this where the sand had sort of built up was dry. And someone said, well, what's the use of that? And Peter Andrews went and grabbed a shovel and dug down a couple of feet, and within maybe, 30 seconds, a minute, that hole had half filled with water. And he said, that's what I'm trying to tell you. What you see is the visible stuff, and there's no water flowing visibly on the surface, but underneath it was still flowing. And that's the thing, I think, where you want to keep it going.
So Charlie, you grew up here and your family's been here for several generations. You obviously have a connection to the place simply by having been here for a long time. But how's that connection to the land changed as the way you've managed the land changed?
Well, I suppose initially it was all about managing the animals. It was all about trying to be more profitable. It was trying to lift production and looking at everything above ground level. And then I think the thing that's changed is that the animals aren't a given. The soil and the plants, they're the thing you really got to look after. And so we've really changed from being an animal manager to probably a soil and plant manager in a way. But that's the most important thing you've got to keep going to keep your animals going. As we've changed the grazing, I think our drenching levels started to drop because the stock were being moved onto cleaner pastures. In the early days, our drenching rate halved from what we were doing previously. I think the stock are healthier, and so I think we've just changed from being managing animals, trying to look at everything for the finances and production levels, but looking at the thing that drives all that, and that's the soil and the plants. And so we've gone probably a full circle, and part of that is managing the water. It's a really resource you can't do without. The big dam we built that we rely on now, that gravity feeds a lot of the place from it, that stream runs for about 7 kilometres from the top end before it gets into the Cambalong Creek. It's got a good spring that keeps on flowing there, and at one stage it had gone from being a 7 kilometre long stream and it was only running for about 3 kilometres. So that it was dry for 2 k's at the end and dry for 2 k's at the bottom, and it just happened to be flowing where our dam was, so it kept it going. And that's why I started to do the Peter Andrews stuff on that stream, because I could see it shortening and shortening, and I just thought, what can I do to make this thing become more permanent? And I thought, well, it was a stream that was in size probably about to the ceiling in places, some places maybe 1 metre to 2 metres. So the things we built there were really pretty simple and small, and so we just tried to hold back the water as much as we could, and to what water was flowing to spread it through the soil. So we did that, and now that stream is flowing really well. In the good years, I measured it at one point, it was flowing at about 2 megalitres a week during the good years. In the dry years, it was getting down to about just under a meg a week flowing. And I haven't recorded it at the moment, but I'd say it's probably flowing at nearly double that rate. So putting all those interventions in with a way to guarantee that really important resource was maintained. Yeah. I suppose the way I describe it, if you have a good year financially, you go to the accountants and you walk out after that meeting, and it's a good feeling having a good year if everything's fallen into place. But all this sort of stuff, doing the stuff with the streams and pastures, you see changes all the time as you go around, and you have a good year. It can be almost every day that you see stuff that's happening. And so it is a satisfying thing for me. Some people would think, you're mad doing this sort of stuff, but to me, you're making a change. Your neighbours downstream can see the change, and I think just the stuff you observe as a result of it are all really positive things. So yeah.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. So thanks so much for sharing with us and for your time. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure, Ellie, and lovely to have you here for your first live interview.
Yeah.
It's much better, I think, eye to eye to see these things. And anyway, lovely to chat with you about it.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
This episode was hosted by me, Ellie Court, and produced by the Grow Love Project. The Communities of Practice project is jointly funded through the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund, Mulloon Institute and Soils for Life. Head to the Soils for Life website to find out more about our work, and if you like what you hear, don't forget to rate and review our podcast. Every review helps to make our podcast easier for others to find. If you have feedback or suggestions of people or topics we should cover, you can reach us at info@soilsforlife.org.au. Thanks for listening.